everyone for joining us today. So my name is Deanna Rhodes. I'm the Executive Director of Connect Summit County, and we are hosting this event. Connect started in 2016 and was actually a group of concerned parents who felt like they just really had nowhere to go when it came to mental health resources. And so they formed an organization, all volunteer run initially, and then now we do have a full team of staff and an excellent board. I noticed a couple of board members on the call, so that's awesome. Thank you so much for being here. And you know, we started off doing May, Mental Health Awareness Month. That was really our signature event, and we've started off, I think there was probably almost 30 events that very first month, which you can imagine was quite a few. So we've had to pivot very quickly, as most of the organizations in town have, to figure out what we do during the time of COVID. Normally, we would love to do this in person. We had the auditorium at Jim Santee all decked out, and a very different panel, but just as an excellent panel planned with James. And so he's been amazing to work with to really shift gears because we know that their mental health is incredibly important. We believe it's always important, but right now with what's going on, you know, we couldn't let this month go by and not be doing the programming. So we have shifted. A lot of excellent help from Betty, who is new to the Connect Summit County team. And we created this concept of creating connections, which makes sense. We're Connect Summit County, so create connections. And we actually kicked it off 2 weeks ago with connecting to ourselves. So we did a mindfulness meditation and a very simple yoga practice. And then we went last week and we had a session with Dr. Wendy Truxell to talk about sleep. I don't care what population you are in. I've talked to everyone about sleep. So that was a really awesome way to really talk about how we're connecting with ourselves during this challenging time. Of course, we have today's panel, which we have a lot of great experts on this panel to talk about community connections. And then on May 31st, the very last day of the month, we're gonna wrap it all up with a party, a Lost Connections virtual party. And that's kind of that connecting to the global. So our community, but invite anyone no matter where they are. And what we're going to be releasing at that time is all the recordings that we've created throughout the month. So being able to package that up in a toolkit or a web page, if you will, so that everybody has access to all of this. So again, thank you so much for joining us today. We really do appreciate it. We think May is incredibly important in bringing more awareness to mental health. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to James. We were on the radio a couple of days ago, and it was for me, James, it was a very weird experience because I couldn't hear anything you said. So I just know that you did an awesome job, and we were playing some very strange vaudeville bit because I wasn't really sure what we were saying. So there we are. But you're definitely a true professional, and we're so grateful to have you help moderate this panel today. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, it's my pleasure to be here, and very, very excited about today's panel and getting to really walk through a little bit about their expertise and talking about meaningful connection in different ways and really coming from different perspectives here. And so what I'd like to do is first just share with you that we have 3 panelists. We've got Jenny Howe, Mary Wright, and James Ott with us today. And why don't we do this? Why don't we just have each of them share a little bit about their background and their expertise, and then we'll start to go down this road with each of them with some very specific questions around meaningful connection and what it means to them, and how they see us being able to really drive deeper connections within our communities and within ourselves. And so why don't I start with you, Mary? Now, Mary, I know we talked a little bit before, but there is a specific expertise that maybe a lot of people haven't heard of before, and that is being an Enneagram. Can you tell us what is the Enneagram specifically, and then maybe give us a little bit of background on where you work and what you do to provide services to the community today?
Sure. Thank you, James. Thanks so much for having me. So yeah, I am an Enneagram coach, and many people are probably not familiar with that term. The Enneagram is a personality typing system. Some of you may be familiar with Myers-Briggs, the introvert-extrovert scale. So it's along those lines. It's more comprehensive, more in depth than that type of tool, but nevertheless, it's a tool that's based in psychology and spirituality. So I would put it in the category of a wisdom tradition. And it describes 9 different personalities or styles of interacting with the world. It's how we see, perceive, relate. And it points out very specific clusters of patterns. And so my background was in addictions counseling. I worked as a family counselor in outpatient drug and alcohol rehab for 25 years. And when I came upon the Enneagram, it was so captivating that I knew that I had a new path. It was as if a whole bunch of pieces, missing pieces to a puzzle, all took their place. And for me personally, I was able to see things with much more clarity, and I love helping people to do the same.
Thank you. Well, we're going to get into that a little bit more after we introduce the rest of the panel. But thank you. I'm very intrigued about this Enneagram and how that relates to connection. So we're going to get back to you on that. Let's move over to you, James Ott. Now, James, you and I, we have a little bit of history together. I've known you for several years, specifically in the addiction recovery space. But why don't you just tell us a little bit about your background and your profession to let the folks know what you're passionate about.
Yeah, and thank you for having me here, everybody, Connect Summit County and James. I'm really excited to be here, be part of this panel, and I hope people can get a lot of answers here. I am a licensed clinical social worker, and I do a lot of work in outpatient mental health and addiction treatment. I do specialize in addiction, and addiction is, I should say, a connection is so important to people with addiction, and we can talk about that a little bit later. But I've been doing this for, I don't know, about 20 years now, so it's been a while.
Yeah, James. So I know one of the things, and I'd like you to also mention, you've got an interesting history with interventions and not in maybe the way that people have seen them on, the A&E TV show interventions. It's a much different model, which I'm going to want to get in with you, because I think all too often we just assume if it's on TV, that's the way you do it. And I think we could learn a lot from the way you approach interventions in particular, that I think are very relatable in all of our relationships, frankly. So I want to make sure that we touch that. And let's go ahead. And Jenny Howe, I'm so grateful that you were able to join us tonight. Why don't you share just a little bit about your background and what gets you excited about your profession?
Yeah, that I could talk about that forever. But I've been doing this a long time, about 40 years. I've done just about everything in mental health. So I worked for youth corrections. I've worked for public schools. I've worked for alternative schools. I've worked for residential programming. But in the last 5 or 6 years, I've really chosen to specialize in anxiety disorders and also OCD. And I was a part of a documentary with Michael Phelps called Angst that really touched on and dove into the idea of teenagers in anxiety. And through that film, I've been able to work with and beginning to work with a lot of different types of media to be able to really break the stigma and to have these conversations about connection and about mental health. And I could talk about anxiety for years and years and years, but just like James referred to, connection is a crucial piece of mental health treatment in general. Whatever we're speaking about, we all have a desire and a need to belong. And that's really the undercurrent underneath a lot of our dysfunction. So yeah, I'm really excited to be here. Thank you for having me and happy to answer anything.
Thanks, Jenny. Well, before we move on, I realized, and maybe this is how etiquette goes with being the moderator, I didn't share anything about me. And so let me quickly just share just a little bit about what I'm passionate about. And you know, when I was 31 years old, I had the opportunity of having one of the fastest growing companies here in Utah. So I was this overachieving entrepreneur that from the outside looking in, a lot of people would have assumed that, man, I just had it all put together. And what they didn't know and what I didn't fully understand was that I was really struggling with depression, anxiety, overwhelm, stress. And eventually I chose to start self-medicating to really fix those feelings. And that started a real different journey that I couldn't have ever predicted. I was high functioning for a long time. And then all of a sudden here I was really struggling to just even survive from day to day. That resulted in a couple of rehab stays for me, a 30-day and a 100-day for substance abuse. I found myself in and out of the psych ward right here in Utah, at the University of Utah, and multiple suicide watches and overdoses. And then 12 years ago, I had a transformational experience, and I was really kind of at my wit's end. I didn't really know where to turn. And it was the connection with my parents at 38 years old that I really had this opportunity to transform everything. And I would say that it had a lot to do with connecting with who I really was. And although I have continued to work on myself, that didn't fix everything, folks. But what it allowed me to do was really notice that I had the ability to connect with something deeper within myself. And a lot of that was because of community that I was a part of and professionals like the ones we have on here today. And I can tell you this, that I know that there is hope. I know that anyone, no matter how bad it looks or feels, that each of us can have that transformative moment. And so ever since that time, for the last 12 years, along with my wife, we have been committed to really supporting people who feel like they don't have the ability to love themselves. We do a lot of work around just reminding people that they matter. And we do a lot of work around proactively addressing mental health and addiction in the workplace. And so for the last several years, that's what we've dedicated our work to, is really working with employer groups and helping them understand how they can better support their employees and loved ones in navigating both mental illness, their emotional well-being overall, and substance use disorders. So just a little bit about me before we get on. But here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to pause for just a second. And we have a group here that, again, I want to thank you for spending some time with us. But I'd like to just ask one question, and I invite all of you to respond, including the panelists and our other hosts from Connect Park City. I want you to share in the chat one of the reasons you're here tonight. I want you to just share what's one reason that you've chosen to be with us tonight. And don't be shy, folks. We want this to be a collaborative effort. And so why don't I just pause for the next second to let some of you write, but let's get some of your reasons for being with us tonight and why this is important. And as we, let's see here, I'm gonna change my chat over here. So why are you here? What's important about being here tonight? Mary, to hear other stories, to know I'm not alone. I love that because I'm feeling disconnected from my normal resources and wanted to be a part of something larger than myself. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. What a pleasure to have you with us. Who else wants to share? Why are you here with us today? What's most important? James, to help people who are struggling with connection. Thank you, James. Anyone else want to share? And as we kind of move on with our panel, just remember that we're available for any of your questions tonight. We're going to be monitoring that group chat throughout the evening. We may not get right to it, but I promise we're going to periodically peek into that to make sure that we do get all of your questions and read those. So Mary, let's go back to you. Tell us a little bit more. Why don't you give us a little bit more detail on this Enneagram that you've been talking about, because you're a coach, you're a teacher, and how does that relate to connection? Because I think most people have heard of the Myers-Briggs assessment. And if you don't, it's an assessment that people can take. Some have probably heard of Strength Finders from the good people at Gallup. And you know, all of this great feedback that we can receive from taking some of these assessments. Why is the Enneagram important for us to know about, and what does it have to do with connection?
Yeah, so I love what you said, James, about connecting to yourself. And I just really appreciated your honest sharing too. So the Enneagram is about connecting to our essence. And the reason that it has a spirituality component is it's really about soul. Our personality, according to Enneagram theory, stands in the way of our inner self. I think most of us are probably aware that we have some things about our personalities that continually get in our way, things that trip us up. Something about ourselves that we would kind of like to change, or that rears its ugly head time and time again. So the Enneagram teaches us to identify some of these less than resourceful patterns, but also focuses on what our true gifts are. And the reason that it's so helpful with connection is once we start to be able to identify our blind spots, we can relax these tendencies, which puts us in a much more receptive position, a less defensive posture, and it opens us up for connection, enhances our current relationships, opens us up to possibilities for new ones in ways that are really pretty profound. When we're operating in our pattern, it's like a default mechanism, and we're not as able to connect when we're in our patterns.
So according to the Enneagram, what causes disconnection, Mary?
Disconnection is really first and foremost about assuming that everybody sees the way we see. So it's like, imagine the Enneagram is based on a system of 9 personalities. So assume that, we're each wearing a different set of colored lenses. And we assume that everyone else is seeing what we see. So, maybe I think it's helpful maybe to be a little bit more specific. So I'll use my own type as an example. I am a type 1, and there's a little name for each of the 9 types. My type is called the reformer. It's somebody who is an idealist, who wants to see everybody adhere to high standards. And there's a lot of frustration in my type when people don't live up to the standards that I set. For the type 1, it's about really wanting to be good, wanting to do things the right way. But each type, there's a conundrum. And the problem is the one wants to be seen as so good and adhering to really high standards, but they come across as critical and judgmental a lot of the time. And this was the big blind spot for me. Very, very painful to recognize after having spent years working on self-awareness. And, when you're a counselor, it's part of your job description. And I spent many years in 12-step recovery, and I considered myself to be pretty self-aware. And when I learned the Enneagram, I was really taken aback by this big blind spot that I had. So to bring it back to connection, if I'm seen as critical by a lot of people in relationships with me, but I'm unaware of that, that's a disconnect. So disconnection occurs in Enneagram theories when we're assuming that people are speaking our language or seeing through our lens. And so we first learn about how we see more objectively. And then as we learn about all 9 types, gosh, it it increases compassion dramatically, because, you know, the person that we've had friction with, the same friction over and over again, all of a sudden we're like, oh, that's why. It's because they see it this way. And we, to a certain degree, we know these things, but the Enneagram points out these patterns that are easier to grasp than just sort of a vague understanding that, yes, we're all different.
So if you know, for many people that are most likely watching right now, this is the first time they maybe have heard of this assessment, or right, or these profiles. If I want to, besides Googling it, is there anywhere specifically you would recommend that we, you know, direct ourselves to maybe learn a little bit more about this, Mary?
Yeah, there are some really great websites. And I would like to just add that the Enneagram isn't, I wouldn't describe it as an assessment.
Okay.
It's a very dynamic, rich, complex system of self-growth. There are some online assessments, but that's the least of it. It's really not about the test. I'm actually not a proponent of the tests because I see them mistype people all the time. But there's one particular starter website called the Enneagram Institute, and that's one that I think is a great place with a whole lot of information in one place.
Thank you so much. You know, it reminds me a little bit, I'm going to go a little off here on a completely different example, but I have, my wife and I have a good friend who had seen himself before working from home for the last 2 months as someone who wanted to maybe even start a business at home, and he wanted to not be spending it with all of his coworkers. And guess what he found out after 2 months at home? He was not built to work from home for long periods of time. And the reason it reminds me of that, Mary, is I think what I'm hearing from you is that it allows us to gain a deeper understanding of ourselves without maybe having to sit at home for 2 months because of COVID-19, right?
Yeah, it really increases our awareness to it shows us how we're wired, really, and that we have reactive patterns that have been with us from the time we were very small, and you know, it's a very transformational system.
Thank you so much. Well, as we move on, I want to make sure if anyone has any questions for Mary to please post those. We'll come back to those. I want to be just sensitive to our time here. And I want to move over to our good friend, James Ott. And James, because I know you, I maybe have a little bit of an advantage here because we've had lengthy discussion for a couple of years now about the philosophy around people who are either struggling with substance use disorders or with mental illness, for that matter. And the one thing that has always rang very true is this idea that connection really is key. Will you speak about that maybe in more specific terms with your background around the importance of relationships and connection, and maybe even talk a little bit about the difference between what we've seen on TV with interventions and what you see as a more effective approach?
Yeah, thank you for this opportunity. I think one of the biggest difficulties here is a lot of the stigmatization that happens with addiction and with mental illness as well. And I talk about mental illness, that could be, you know, severely chronic mental illness like schizophrenia, or it could be depression and anxiety. So when I say mental illness, it means all of that. But I think of the example of, what really draws me out is the example of Philip Seymour Hoffman. Now, we all know who he is, hopefully. He, amazingly talented actor. And he struggled with addiction, was in and out of rehab several times. And then towards, he eventually overdosed and died. But what was really interesting was that towards the end of his life, there were specific examples of him under the influence, nodding off. He was in restaurants and falling asleep at the table. And what happened is the paparazzi went nuts on this. They took all sorts of pictures. Is Philip Seymour Hoffman using? We think he is. And nobody intervened. And this is, to put this in context, this is the same example as if I was at a restaurant and suddenly I'm clutching my heart and falling on the floor, people would be dialing 911, people would be intervening, administering CPR, or if I'm doing this, people come over and do the Heimlich on me and everything. These are life-threatening conditions that people would immediately react to save a life. And yet we're seeing a lot of this, we saw a lot of the same symptoms, but we think, oh, addiction is such a private disease, or mental health is such a private disease. This person's depressed, but he doesn't want to be bothered. And I think the whole symptom and response of both addiction and mental health is people want to isolate. People want people to stay away. There's a lot of shame associated with this. And all the more reason for us to reach out. If we see people with symptomology of a life-threatening condition, no matter what that is, we should be reaching out and trying to give them help and support. What can I do? Stay away. I don't want your help. Look, I'm really worried about you. I'm concerned. I don't know what I can do, but what can I do to help you? Can I just come over and be with you? Are you willing to go see a professional, someone that can help just even assess and give us some ideas about what your options are? And so that's all part of that connection piece, is how do we reach out? How do we keep people connected that are having these symptoms? That's why I believe AA, other 12-step groups, other types of support groups for addiction and mental health wellness, and like NAMI, for example, is that this connects people together. I come to a meeting and I say, I'm James and I'm an alcoholic. I have an eating disorder. I'm severely depressed. And people say, welcome. We accept you for who you are, and you don't need to be anybody but you. And this connection, it can be so healing and so helpful. So I think that's, again, a huge portion that we're missing with people that have mental health and addiction issues is they want to disconnect, and it's even more crucial that we stay connected. Now James talked about a type of intervention that I do. I'm a certified ARISE interventionist, and it's a little bit of a different process. It's not a one-time, we got to get our loved one to treatment, or I'm really tired of this behavior, I'll give it one shot and then we're done. This type of addiction is simply a series of very specific structured meetings, connecting the family together and discussing the issues, including the person who has the problem, whether that's a mental health or an addiction issue. We invite this person, tell us what you think is going on, tell us what you see, tell us what help you're needing. And the whole purpose of this is not that confrontation. You have an addiction issue, it's driving us crazy, you need to go to rehab and get fixed. But it's more of like, we have a family member that has a problem that needs a lot of help. How can we come together to help this person? So that's kind of a brief summary of the work I do with families with addiction. But thank you for this opportunity, James.
Yeah, no, thank you. And a couple of things I want to just reiterate that I heard as you were sharing, and that is coming together, and this idea, the Philip Seymour Hoffman example is so real that, and because we work in the corporate space a lot, it happens there all the time, right? And so yes, people feel hesitant, and so this is what I heard through all of that, if I may, is demonstrating genuine concern. That in itself is such a shift from, oh, that's a problem, and we almost either jump on it, or we make fun of it, or we ignore it. And when we demonstrate genuine concern for another human being, that's just going to show up a little bit differently. And And the other thing that really came to mind is this idea of really creating kind of the space. And I know you didn't say that specifically, but I know that that's really what you're alluding to, is creating this space because of the genuine concern. So I have a question for you, James, because I get this all the time. So what about me trying to fix my loved one if they're struggling with mental health or addiction?
Well, would you perform open heart surgery on your loved one, right? or do someone's corporate taxes? That's kind of beyond me. But, you know, and even as a trained professional, that's not my role to be a therapist for my kids, as my teenage daughter reminds me of all the time. But really, like, you know, I want to illustrate this point here. Some good friends of mine, they lost their child after 6 months old, and it was devastating. And my friend went back to work, and you know, at one point I checked in with him. How are you doing? And he said, it's just the weirdest thing. Everybody knows in the office that I've lost my, you know, daughter. I lost my 6-month-old daughter, and nobody wants to talk about it. People just, they stand there. It's either awkward, or they pretend it doesn't happen, and he's like, there's sometimes I'm just sitting in my cubicle and just weeping, and nobody says anything. Or he said, even people come up and just talk to me as if I'm not crying. And I said, what do you want them to do? And he said, I just want someone to say, hey, I don't even know what to say, but I care, and I'm sorry you're having such a hard time. Is there anything I can do to help? So just the basic acknowledgement creates that space. Like, I see you're struggling, and I'm here for you to support. I don't want to pretend to have any of the answers, but I'm just here. What can we do?
So being with someone or connecting, right?
That authentic piece is what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Just being authentic with someone.
Thank you so much. Because it's one that we have gotten a lot before, is what do I do? And that being with part, and just allowing yourself, making yourself available for somebody, no matter what that looks like, I think is such a great start for people. Well, thank you, James. I know we're going to come back to you. And again, people, I know if you've got some questions, and I know we're going to get back to some of these here in a minute, but I want to make sure, Jenny, I'm so intrigued with some of the work that you've been doing. And did I see, did I read this right? San Diego? No?
I'm originally from San Diego, yes.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, thanks. And you're now here in Utah, right?
Yes.
So tell us a little bit more about the work that you do, in particular with children, because I know you mentioned that, and you know, there are probably a lot of parents. James just mentioned that he's a parent too. But why don't you talk a little bit about how do we support our kids? How do we talk to them? How do we connect with them? Maybe just share a little bit of that. And then I want to go and move into, because we've had a couple of questions about anxiety around COVID-19, and maybe it's going back to work or going back to, you know, into our communities. So those are the two things I'd love for you to share.
Yeah, so I have to integrate a little bit with what James was saying just a moment ago, but I have to let you guys know too, my original background is in addiction. My father's a recovering alcoholic and addict. He got sober when I was close to 8 years old. And that was the impetus for my entire career. He stayed sober for that long, and not that it hasn't been a daily battle, but the 12 steps and recovery and change and growth and evolvement have been a part of my life and a part of my childhood. And so it's when we talk about patterns with the Enneagrams, that's been my pattern, is people change. I know that for a fact. If there's anything I know for certain, people can change. So I just have to echo some of the things you guys are saying here today. But yeah, specifically with showing up for people, I just did an article with the Deseret News this week, and we talked about this very thing. How do we show up for people who are grieving, people who need connection? What do we need to do? And one of the things I said to the reporter who was talking to me was, you know what? We just need to stop it with the social norms of, okay, well, first I need to call and ask if it's okay, or I need to send a text and make sure it's okay that I call. No, let's not do that anymore. Let's just show up. And I can tell you with certainty the times in my life people have shown up for me. Friday was my son's birthday, and he has special needs. He turned 14. He wasn't supposed to live. His name's Deacon. He's darling, and you might hear him while I'm unmuted in the other room. But he, and we had a wonderful day, right? But then amidst this whole COVID thing, how do we celebrate? How do I make him feel special? He's nonverbal. Somebody showed up at my door around 6 p.m. We were singing happy birthday. An old friend of mine who I didn't expect showed up with balloons and cookies and just said, hey, I know it's your son's birthday today. Here you go. It was the most genuinely kind. I mean, it meant so much more to me than I think it did even my son, obviously. But to just show up for somebody is so incredibly powerful. Let's forgo social norms and just show up. So I echo everything you guys have been saying. And to branch that into connecting with our teenagers and our kids, I also have a daughter who's almost 18, senior this year, the class of 2020, who's had a lot of her own grief and struggle and loss of connection as she has ended the school year. She said to me one day, and she's not a very sentimental or emotional kid like me. She's not, we're not the same. We have different Enneagrams. But she definitely came to me like, I don't know, a week or two ago, and she was like, Mom, this is kind of sad. Like, I just never went back to school. And I was like, yeah, it is really sad. And it opened up a conversation. But something that I do in my own home is I screw up a lot. I don't know about you guys, but I screw up almost 100% of the time. And I'm supposed to be an expert, right? I talk about this stuff on TV, for heaven's sakes. But I screw up in my home every single day. And I have made it my mission to talk about how much I screw up with my child in my home. And I'm a single parent. And when I have these emotional outbursts, or when I'm really stressed out and I'm projecting it onto other people, I label it and I talk about it. And I say things like, man, Abby, you know what? I'm not sure I can have a conversation with you right now because I have these 3 things happening in my head and you're really important to me. And I'm afraid if I have this conversation right now, I'm not going to give it the attention I need to. And so can we have it in about 30 minutes when I'm feeling like my emotions are settled again? And I give words and life to that emotional regulation process with her. And she doesn't always get it. And she thinks I'm way overly therapeutic. I'm with you on that one, James. But she does understand at least the language. And she knows that it's always going to be okay to screw up. That's the one thing I've really wanted to make it my mission as a parent. And I think connecting with our kids is really about that. It is not about being perfect. It is not about telling them what to do. It is not about teaching them all the right things and making sure they do all their homework right now during this ridiculous time. It's about making sure that they know it's okay to fail, it's okay to make mistakes, and it's okay to talk about it. And just like the board says behind you, James, it's okay not to be okay. There's so much power in that. And that's really the space where connection is built, especially inside our homes.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I love that so much. You know, my wife and I are a blended family, and we have 6 of our 9 kids still living with us.
Oh, wow.
And our youngest just turned 6 on Friday. So we're sharing a birthday in the families there, which is awesome. And them knowing that they matter and that we aren't perfect and that we're going to get through this is just so vital and important. And I know I want to go to Wendy's question, because this is just a perfect segue, Jenny, where she's talking about her 28-year-old son struggling with anxiety, depression, and addiction.
Yeah. She'd
like to maybe hear a little bit more about what she can do or what options. And I'm gonna let you go ahead and start this, Jenny. But please, James and Mary, please come in after that if you've got any other words. And I know this is difficult because we don't know really a whole lot, but maybe just some common things that I think could be helpful for Wendy.
Absolutely. Yeah, I have parents of adult children reach out to me all the time and ask the same question. Hey, how can I get them to do something about this? And I love that because I'm a codependent at heart. And so I totally get where that is coming from. Like, hey, I want to be able to help this person for them. The best advice I can give somebody in terms of resources, first of all, there are a myriad of resources, and any one of us can point you to resources for young adults that need support and treatment. But if we have a child that needs support and treatment who maybe isn't amenable, and I'm just playing a little bit of assumption there, but maybe isn't amenable to coming to treatment. It sounds like James does some great work with some interventions, but it's really about how can I make myself okay with what I can control, and focusing on what I can control and providing the love and support without crossing that line into enablement and accommodation that we love to do as codependents, speaking for myself, and getting my own work done so that I can be the best person to show up for the person in my life who I love the most. And rather than trying to fix them when I show up, I can be with them in their moments of crisis and pain. And so it's really about doing our own work at the time. It's less about what treatment center is going to be the best fit and more about how can I prepare myself to be supportive of them when they choose.
I'm glad you brought that up, Jenny, because it reminds me of if I am on an airplane and they're going through all the emergency protocols and they say, if the oxygen mask falls down, what do they tell you to do first?
Put on your own.
Put on your own first. And I think all too often we forget, in fact, how many times have we heard of a parent losing themselves in the addiction of their loved one?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Right? James, would you mind speaking into this just a little bit about any thoughts you have? And I know that we've got limited information here, but what are some things that come to mind that you might share?
Yeah, I would definitely echo what Jenny said about the importance of doing your own work, because the family has to be doing, the family or the loved one, whoever that is, has to be able to have that that balance of compassion and acceptance and boundaries, and not get sucked in and draw that up. Now, the flip side here is, not doing anything is not acceptable. And it's okay to come to the person and say, look, I believe you're struggling. What can we do here? I want to help you. And again, think of if this person had the flu, or if this person was having some financial stressors, or if this person was having, some other issue in their lives, we would come to that person and address them the same way. Now, addiction's a little bit tricky because addiction's one of the only illness that tells us there's nothing wrong going on. But approaching the person and just saying, I'm concerned, what can I do to help? But even more so, and this is why intervention can be so powerful, is because family is such a great influential factor on an individual. And one person coming to that, person and saying, can I do anything, is going to make some impact. But a family coming together and saying, we're very concerned, can we figure this out together as a family? Let's be strong, and let's do what we can. Family is a lot more powerful than any sort of professional. Now the last thing here is you have Al-Anon out there, you have Smart Recovery, you have the craft model of families helping people, their loved ones get addicted, or get their loved one with addiction getting well. There's a great book called Getting My Loved One the Help That They Need, that also talks about what can we be doing as a family. So going out and getting the support you need as well as family members. You don't have to do this alone.
Thanks for sharing that. And James, would it be fair to say that if you've got some trusted friends in that close circle of influence, is that recommended as well?
Absolutely. That's family, right? Whose family is people that love and care about you, and that are invested and have some sort of influence.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Mary, any final comments on this particular subject before we move on to a couple of other discussions?
Yeah, I would say that I'd very much echo what Jenny was talking about, which is focusing on what you can control, and very much like Al-Anon, the Enneagram would say manage your own reactivity. But before you can manage your reactivity, you have to be able to identify, what is it that it's difficult for you, and the Enneagram is just so helpful with helping us to target and hone in on those things.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm going to share one thing as I'm looking at a couple of other comments. Rochelle, you're talking about treatment that insurance doesn't cover. So a couple of things, and this is for all of you. One of the reasons that Connect Summit is out there, folks, is to provide support and resources. They're a great community to reach into, because the good news is they also are connected to us. And this is what my wife and I and our entire team does. And we are more than happy to kick around some ideas with you and maybe finding some of those alternate resources. But our friends through Betty and Deanna, you can absolutely start that process of maybe looking at some other available avenues that you can go. Here's what I know, that I believe that when we really open ourselves up, that it might take a little bit of work and a little bit of heavy lifting, but there's always a resource out there. And I can promise you that when you find caring people out there, we're going to do everything we possibly can to point you in that direction. So please reach out. Thank you for sharing that. And it looks like in that chat, we've got a lot of the different resources that are available out there, but we're more than happy to meet you where you're at and see if we can find some other solutions. So just know that. So let's go on, folks. I want to make sure there's been a couple of other comments that I want to kind of go back to here for a second. And while I'm doing that, maybe we can open it up to Deanna and or Betty. Why don't you speak into the room for just a moment, and why don't you share a little bit about what you've heard tonight, what's impacted you, maybe any other additional comments to what's been shared so far tonight.
Well, thanks, James. So first of all, I just think it's just been a really great conversation, and I'm so appreciative of everybody dropping their comments in the chat and asking the questions. I think that really helps make this that dynamic, two-way conversation. So thank you for showing up, and I've gotten a lot of really great things out of it today. I think, it got put into the chat there, but definitely when it comes to resources, and she's with us on the call, so you can see her beautiful face if you have video. But our peer navigator is Linda Stedman. So if Linda, if you just want to wave, there you are. And she does a really wonderful job with our resource line, which is, her role is very much to listen and help present these options for consideration, but first and foremost is listening. And something I'm really proud of is that by calling that number, you are so far we've been averaging an hour and a half of spending time with people, which a lot of times when you are frustrated, as somebody put in the chat, like trying to find the resources, it takes that long, if not longer. And so we have someone here to really help walk through those resources. The number is 435-776-HELP, HELP, or you can email resources with an S at connectsummitcounty.org. So that's a really great place to start. It started off as a little bit of a joke of the way we were going to market it, but I think it's going to stick, and really it's start here. And that, I think, is one of the very best places to start. And then we can start to help you through the process. Sometimes you don't want to reach out, you're still looking kind of for your own. So we put another link in the chat, which is a toolkit that our team has put together. And we're really proud of this because we were very nimble, and there's a lot of things that have changed since COVID. So we tried to put together all the resources with the most up-to-date information. And that's laid out like frequently asked questions type of thing. So it's a great simple guide. Again, if you get stuck and frustrated, don't swirl, reach out to the resource line, because that can really help get you going. So yeah, I just wanted to offer that. So thank you for that opportunity.
So thank you, Deanna. I want to go to one of our latest comments and just distill it into the last thing that she shared. And so Mary's talking about a 21-year-old that's currently homeless with schizoaffective is his diagnosis. He's angry, and she's asking about how can caregivers deal best with guilt and shame. So who wants to take that one? That one's another one that I know we hear a lot. But any of you want to raise your hand first and maybe talk a little bit about how they and maybe I'm looking at you, James, because I know you so well. Do you want to make a comment on that in particular?
Yeah, and I'd also like to hear from Jenny and Mary, because I'm sure they have
absolutely
much wiser things than I can say. This is a difficult situation. And I think in short, finding ways to deal with the guilt and shame, and there's a whole thing about what's guilt and what's shame, and guilt can actually be really healthy to motivate us to correct things we're doing wrong that are outside our own ethics and morals. Shame is more of a tool that's used to make you feel like you're worthless. And so there's that piece, and our motivation should be out of health and love, and not shame and destruction. So my piece here, the short of it, is how do you stay connected to your son while having healthy boundaries, while being compassionate, while not trying to rescue and save. It's a very, very, very tough situation, and I'm sorry that you are going through this. But I would suggest working with a therapist or working with some people on figuring this out. How do I best help my son in this situation, especially from 500 miles away?
Thank you, James. Jenny, do you want to go ahead and speak to this really quick?
Yeah, I want to kind of just go over the boundary piece, which I think is so crucial here. And people ask all the time, and I struggle with this myself, how do we set boundaries with people when we know that their actions or their behaviors isn't necessarily aligned with who they are and their character and the things we know and love about them? And Brene Brown says it best. I think there's no one better than Brene Brown when it comes to boundaries and how to do them. But she says direct is kind. And so sometimes we feel like it's best to be a little bit less explicit, like to kind of skirt around things that are uncomfortable and conflictual to talk about. And in this case, being so extreme in terms of the logistics and the mileage between it and the diagnoses, that I could see how that would be difficult to talk about. But if I were in the situation to bring this up and set a boundary, I might say something like, it's really difficult to understand how to help you best when we don't communicate very often. And I need to be able to communicate with you so that I know you're safe. So can we come up with a plan where you connect with me and let me know where you are and if you're safe? And that helps me feel connected to you. And that helps you know that I care. And I'm not going to ask questions or judge, but I need to know that you're safe. And that's a very direct, explicit statement. And of course, that's so, I don't know the specifics of the situation, if that was even possible, but a way to set a direct boundary. When we talk about our needs and what we need from other people, it's best to be clear, direct, and explicit. And so I am so sorry for this situation. And I know boundaries are so difficult to navigate, even with somebody who's sitting right in front of us. I can't imagine how difficult that would be, so far away.
Yeah, thank you. And let's go, Mary, to you for just some final comments on this particular topic.
Yeah, I really feel for your situation. And to address the question about how do you deal with the guilt and the shame, I think it's really worthy of exploration. you know, really take a look at the guilt and shame. And for each of the 9 types from the Enneagram lens, you know, there's some people who are very, very familiar with guilt and shame as a theme throughout their life. And this is sometimes a signal that it's time to move on. And there's a lot of different ways that we can do that with the Enneagram. But for other people, it's a new feeling. It's not something that has been a theme. And so then it's worthy of exploration for that reason, and lots of things in between. So I would really encourage just thinking about what is the pattern in your life with those feelings, and what does it mean?
Thank you, Mary. Well, folks, believe it or not, that is our time for the panel. Now, one of the things that we had chosen to do, we know, Rochelle, if you're already gone, we certainly appreciated your participation and your comments. Thank you for being a part of this with us tonight. But if any of you would like to stick around and ask some other questions, we're going to make ourselves available. I think we're going to do it just in this one room together rather than doing any breakouts. But we're going to stick around if anyone has any other very specific questions, and we'll do that. But if we understand if you need to drop off, folks, we again thank you so much for being a part of this with us tonight. And Connect Summit County, thank you for hosting this. So with that, let's go ahead and open this up to anyone who would like to reach in. And I don't know if this is where maybe it's more discussionary or if we want to keep it with just the chat. I'm going to leave that up to Deanna and Betty. What are your thoughts, folks? What would you like to see happen here as we kind of shift gears from more of a panel discussion to more of a community discussion?
I think that in keeping with, you know, creating connection, it would make sense to allow people to unmute themselves if they have a question. And if that gets unruly, we can always just go back to the chat. We can be fluid, I think.
Well, it does look like an unruly crowd, so I think it's a little risky. No, it's a beautiful crowd. We have loved the engagement. So why don't we do that? If any of you would like to speak into the room, please do that. If you've got any specific questions or anything else that you'd like to share.
I have a question. I am noticing a lot of really, really big emotions showing up for my 5-year-old around, you know, not going back to school and missing his friends, and actually like being fearful of moving into first grade, which has always been a very exciting thing for him as far as like progressing. And the other night I was in a space of really listening to him and letting him get his feelings out, but I'm curious because it lasted for a very long time. So I felt like at some point I was doing more harm than good. And so I'm curious if you guys have any tools or ideas around like really big emotions for kiddos that are, you know, missing their ways of social interacting, and how I can support him even more.
I think I'll go if you don't mind. I work with little kids all the time in my practice, so I'm happy to answer this. Little kids and their big feelings are just basically the same as us and our big feelings. And sometimes we just don't know what to do with ourselves when we have big feelings. And for kids that tend to ruminate or spiral or kind of go into a loop about their feelings, there's an analogy that I like to use, which is big feelings sometimes come and knock at our door. And when we open the door, we recognize that it's like the nosy neighbor who we really can't stand very much, and we don't necessarily want to invite in to join us for dinner, but we are more than happy to speak with them at the door for a little while and entertain them. And so the concept behind that is, okay, when I'm feeling something big, I want to acknowledge it. I want to create space for it. However, I don't want it to control my actions. I want to be able to respond to that emotion and not react to it. And we want to teach our children to label, to catch it, right? Call it out, and then change it if they want to change it. And giving him, is it a boy? Did you say boy? Giving him the opportunity to kind of say, yeah, this is safe. It's safe for me to express that. However, I don't have to have my emotion drive my action. It doesn't need to be the person steering the ship, right? And as parents, our natural inclination is to nurture and love and let them get all those big feelings out. And that's a good thing. We want to do that. However, we also want to model that it's appropriate to do so at certain times. And it's appropriate to do so without continuing to allow that emotion to dictate your behavior. So kind of setting the stage and modeling something like, I would love to spend the next 5 minutes chatting with you about how you feel. And then I would love for you to draw a picture about it and bring it to me later. And that gives them the tools to both verbalize it and then kind of engage in their own learning and coping skill development of self-regulation as well. And we want to give them both. We want our children to feel supported, and we also want to give them the tools to support themselves.
Hi, everyone. It's Linda. And I had a question about dealing with fear and panic, anxiety during this time. Thanks.
I don't want to take over. Does anybody else want to answer it? This is my specialty, fear. I specialize in fear. And so panic and fear, regardless of the trigger or the circumstance, it runs through the same science in our brain. Okay, so we have 3 parts of our brain that are the most important parts of our brain when we're talking about fear. We have the brainstem, which is where all information goes in and we decide if it needs to go into a higher level of thinking. It's filtered through our limbic system or our emotional brain, and it goes to the amygdala, which is the fear center of the brain. Now, the logical part of the brain, the frontal lobe, comes at the very end. And that's what makes us uniquely human, is the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe gives us the ability to think about our feelings and to think about our thinking rather than just react. When we are afraid, like so many of us are right now in this pandemic, we tend to go straight into that amygdala. And the amygdala is the most primal part of our brain. It does not understand anything but life or death. So when we feel afraid, it's just going alert, 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 alert. There's this alarm system happening. And my frontal lobe up here is like, look, you're going to be okay. Things are okay. It's trying to rationalize with us. But the problem is when the amygdala fires up, it turns off all neural pathways to the frontal lobe. It literally doesn't engage. We have lots of functional MRIs that show us the data behind this. And so we can't think about our fear when we're in the middle of it. So when somebody's having a panic attack and we go up to them and we say something like, well, hey, just tell me what's wrong. How can I help you? That person has no idea what to do. How many of you have ever just freaked out when somebody said that? I don't know. I don't know what's happening. I don't know. We literally don't know because the amygdala has overtaken, it's hijacked our brain, and it's told us that we're going to die. That's why it feels like death when we have a panic attack, because our body goes into survival mode. And there's science behind that as well. I won't bore you with. So what we do, and the only thing that works when somebody is in a state of panic or fear, is distraction. Now, we don't want to move into unhealthy distraction, right? But we want to be able to provide tools to give us ways to engage and incorporate our frontal lobe into our daily functioning. So you hear a lot of people talking about schedules and routines, and these are the Netflix shows I'm watching. Those are all the frontal lobe's ways of trying to get the brain to kind of regulate fear and inside the brain during this really uncertain time. And so that is a real small version. I could go into a whole other version on exposure therapy, but that's kind of the science behind panic and why we feel the way we do right now, why everybody's having trouble sleeping, why it feels like we're just doing our best to survive and hang in there. It's because our amygdala has hijacked everything. So the more we can distract and engage that frontal lobe, the better we're going to be able to kind of incorporate our emotional brain and our logical brain to create that wise mind.
Thank you, Jenny.
Yeah.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. This is Mary. I'm the one who has a 21-year-old son, and I'm dealing with that. But this question is not pertaining to that. This is more about the Enneagram that Mary Wright has spoken about. I'm really curious about that. This is new to me, and I would like to know, specific examples of people who really have come to learn about their type, Myers-Briggs, but this is the Enneagram, and how that really helps them in life going forward, just increased awareness on how they are as a person, and in helping others in their professional work, whatever they do. Can you give some examples of Enneagrams have actually helped people in personal relationships?
Yeah, I could give you a really simple example just from my own family this past week. So here we are, my adult kids are quarantined with us, and it's a lot of together time, isn't it, right? So one night I was preparing dinner, and dinner was ready, and we were about to sit down, and my son abruptly says, "I need alone time." Very, kind of in a nasty tone of voice, and just, stormed out of the room. And before the Enneagram, I can tell you exactly what would have happened. My daughter is the type 8 on the Enneagram. It's a challenger. They're very concerned with justice and fairness, and they get right up into people's faces to protect other people. And she would have gone into protection mode of me. And she would have bullied him by saying, you're being completely disrespectful. Mom was nice enough to make dinner for us. Sit your ass down, or something like. It would have been very, very rough. All of us are familiar with the Enneagram. My husband is a type 6. It's called the skeptic. They question everything. His response would have been, I wonder what happened. Does anybody know? Did he talk to his boss today? Did he have a problem at work? Is there something going on with his girlfriend? And all the questions. And me as a type 1, who's the critical perfectionist, probably would have given him a little lecture about that it was rude. And then I secretly would have felt very resentful that my kitchen was going to get messed up later in the evening. And we would have sat down, and everybody would have been mad. And I should add that my son is the type 5, which is the investigator, and his type needs a tremendous amount of alone time. We all know this about him. And so we looked at each other and we said, oh, the 5s hit the wall, right? We know it's not a preference for him to have alone time. We know he needs more than other people. And so all of us, all that reactivity, boom, no reactivity in that moment. We knew that our 5 needed space, and we just sat down and enjoyed our dinner, and there was no tension. Later on, a couple of hours later, my son came up and said, I'm really sorry. I overreacted, and said a whole bunch of nice things, made himself something to eat, and cleaned up. And so what would have been before the Enneagram, probably pretty much ruining the evening, it would have been a family fight. There was no problem. So that's a very small example, but in all of our interactions, we have our own reactivity that we all have blind spots that we're pretty unaware of. And so when we become more aware of it, we can just bring a different side of ourselves, our higher nature, into all of our relationships. And then as we really learn the system, we can start to pinpoint what the motivations and needs are of other people. And what I'll often say is, if you care about someone and you know what they need, don't you just naturally want to give it to them? So often we assume through our own lenses we assume what we think other people need, and we're wrong a lot. So the Enneagram gives this really, this great insight into how we're all so different. And then we can meet our needs, each other's needs more effectively, and increase connection.
I love that, because as parents, we know that some of our kids are just night and day from each other, you know, and the same parents are raising them. So this seems like almost something that should be required of employers to do for their new employees, just to learn of their personality type and their Enneagram.
It's huge in the business world. There's a whole, Google, for instance, Microsoft uses it. I think Facebook offers every new employee the opportunity to learn the Enneagram. So it's very helpful in business.
It's great.
Thank you.
Great. Any other questions, folks? What a great set of questions, and appreciate all the answers. I'm now thinking, Mary, about me, my wife, and my 9 kids, and a couple of their spouses. Like, I'm like, oh, maybe they're that, or oh, they're that. So I don't know if does that already give away which one I am? No.
It's not that simple.
Well, folks, let's just do one more quick round. Any other comments or questions before we start to wrap up tonight? What a beautiful experience for me to be a part of this with all of you, and thank you for being open and asking the questions, and for just an amazing panel. Really appreciate all 3 of you for taking the time tonight. We know how busy everyone is. And in particular, Betty, thank you for all that you did to prepare us for this evening. We couldn't have done it with your support. And then, of course, Deanna, for really this being your brainchild of making that pivot amid some pretty unusual circumstances. So kudos to you for being able to have the vision to take this forward into our community. I think that shows so much about how you as an organization are really leaning into supporting our communities and really creating connection, regardless of how far apart we are. So really much gratitude for providing the platform for all of us to have these real discussions. So anything else before we wrap up tonight? One more shot, folks. Any other questions or comments before we close out this evening? We'll give it. Yeah, go ahead.
This is Wendy with Connect. So I have a question and a comment. And the question is, it sounds like you're talking about connection and healing. And so the book Lost Connections and Chasing the Scream by Johann Hari, is that something that you work from, recommend, utilize in your interventions and sharing with families? Or what is your take on that? And then my comment was about the Enneagram, and I can't remember exactly what type I was, but the thing that I wanted to just say, especially because Mary asked about examples, and Mary and I can talk later, I have lots of examples and how it helped me years ago, just to understand different people see things differently. And I liked how it gives you like healthy and unhealthy expression of your natural tendencies. That was really key for me. So anyway.
Thank you, Wendy.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone want to comment on that? Mr. Ott, you're unmuted, so maybe.
Oh, I was just gonna say thank you for having us be here. So it's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. Anyone want to comment on Lost Connections and Chasing the Scream by Johann Hari? Anything anyone would like to share on Wendy's last question? I can make one comment, and that is my experience and everything that I've seen, connection really is key. I mean, I know that sounds like this blanket statement, but I think the more committed we are to genuinely being interested in one another and looking out for each other, and really coming from the heart. I know that was part of my own transformation when my parents did that with me 12 years ago. So that would be my blanket statement on that is I just know that connection is absolutely at the core of really everything. And I have the opportunity to do a lot of webinars, and I've done more webinars in the last 2 months than I've done in my entire life, like many of you. And I asked the one question, what's one good thing that's come out of the pandemic? And guess what the number one answer is? More connection with my loved ones, with my kids. Like, I'm going to tell you folks, and then I'll end with this. Before all of this, did y'all see my little 6-year-old princess?
Yes.
I would have been, oh my gosh, oh no, you got to stay. Because that was kind of what I had held as a belief of, no, I need it. And now it's like, you know what? I forgot to lock the door. Whoop-de-doo. It's no big deal. And there just seems to be a deeper sense of people being okay with connecting in all forms. And so thank you again. I'll personally close with that. I'm going to turn it back over to Deanna to kind of walk us out today. And any final comments from anyone else, please share.
I just want to say that, or I want to ask James, if you and presenters would be willing to come back and do this for hopefully 100 plus people in our community in the future, because I think this was amazing. And I wish we could get more people to connect like this. Would you be willing to do this again, 2, 3, 4 months from now?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak for the rest of the panel, but I think that the group is very open and very giving, and I think it would just, be a matter of coordination and finding out everybody's time. But I'm always game for supporting our communities in any way I can.
Excellent. Thank you. It's been really great. All of you, Jenny, James, Mary, thank you for being here tonight.
And
My pleasure.
In the spirit of kind of wrapping things up and addressing what you just said, Mary, we were actually really fortunate that James Hadlock and Jenny Howe were on our schedule originally. And then Mary was on the schedule with the Christian Center to be kind of one of our partner events to teach the Enneagram and really go through that workshop. And then we just got this bonus of meeting James Ott and really having him now in our space. So I think that there's certainly lots of things that we can continue to consider to do, and we just have to unfortunately wait and see a little bit how it all goes. But I think James Ott, we have you now. You're ours. You're in our space, so we're not letting go. And I would say that for the other 3 panelists. So thank you just so much for doing this, for shifting, for bringing your all, especially when it didn't look the way we had initially hoped it might look. So absolutely. So. And with that being said, again, thank you so much, everyone, for your time, your questions, just being present. And we will record this, so we'll release that. And I noticed Betty put in the chat everyone's contact information. So if you want to connect with people one-on-one, you have that resource there, as well as we'll send a little wrap up tomorrow that will have that information as well.
Great.
Cool.
Great.
All right. Well, with that, then I think we're complete. Thank you, everybody. Please stay safe out there, and also remember to stay connected. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.